In the last lecture, I told you that finding primitives is different from finding reference types. So let's see why. I'm going to start by declaring a new array called courses. And in this array, we're going to have a couple of course objects. So here's the first one with two properties, ID and name. The name doesn't really matter. Now we can duplicate this line by holding down Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. So let's change these values, ID 2 and name B. And don't forget the semicolon here. So we have two course objects here. Let's see if we have a course with the name A in this array. The includes method that you learned in the last lecture will not help us here. Now, let me show you. So courses dot includes. Here we pass the object that we're looking for. So course with the ID 1 and name A. Now, let's log this on the console. Console.log. Save the changes. We get false. The reason for this is because these two objects, that is the object that we're passing to the includes method, and the object that we have in the courses array, these are two different objects. They have two different references. They're in two different locations in memory. And in the last section, you learned that objects are reference types. So when we check them for their equality, the references are checked. In this case, there are two different references. That's why we get false. So if you have an array with reference types, you need to use the find method. Let me show you. So I'm going to delete this line. Courses.find. Now look at the parameter of this method. What we see here is way too complicated. So whenever you want to learn about an object or a function in JavaScript, simply search for that. JavaScript array find. Here the first link is from developer.mozilla.org. So that's a good reference. Here you can find a good description of what this method does and a very simple example of using that method. So here we have an array with a few numbers. We're calling the find method. Note that as an argument to this method, we have to pass a function. We call this function a predicate, and we use that to determine if the given element exists in an array or not. So this function takes a parameter that's an element in this array. And in the body of this function, we should return a Boolean. So here we have a simple expression. If this element is greater than 10, we'll return true, otherwise we'll return false. So this is what happens when we call the find method and pass this function. This function is executed once for the first element in this array. So in this case, 5 will be passed here. 5 is not greater than 10, so we'll return false, and the search will continue. Now this function will be called for the second element in this array. So 12 will be passed as an argument to this function, and because it's greater than 10, we'll return true, and the search will stop here. So now, what we'll get here as a result of calling the find method is the first element that matches this criteria. So if we log this found variable on the console, we'll get 12. Now in contrast, if there are no elements in this array that matches this criteria, we'll get undefined. Let me show you. So back to our example, let's say we want to see if we have a course with the name A in this array. So we pass a function here. We call this a predicate or a callback function, because this function is called back as part of finding an element in this array. So here we should have a parameter. We can call that element or course, because each element in this array is a course object. So it's better to be more explicit. That makes our code more readable and understandable. So what is our criteria? We are looking for a course with the name equal to A. So we simply return this. And let's store the result in a constant called course. And finally, let's log this on the console. Here's the course object, save the changes, and that's the course with the name A. We get the complete course object that we have in this array. Now, if I change the search criteria to something like this, X, Y, Z, obviously we don't have a course with this name, So when we save the changes, we get undefined. So here's our find method. It returns the first element that matches this criteria. We have a similar method called find index. It works exactly the same, but instead of returning the actual object, like the course object, it will return its index. Let me show you. So I'm going to change this to find index. In this case, we don't have a course with this name. So when I save the changes, we should see -1 on the console. Here it is. Now, if I change this back to A and save the changes, we get 0 because the index of the first element that matched this criteria is 0.